To many fans, One Piece was born in the year 1999, when the Toei anime first started airing. However, to slightly more knowledgeable fans, it was born in 1997, when the very first chapter of the manga was published. Although to obsessive men making videos on the internet, One Piece was born in 1996, when Eiichiro Oda published his 2 Romance Dawn prototypes. However, to the author, Eiichiro Oda himself, One Piece was actually born in 1984, when his 9-year-old self picked up a copy of Weekly Shonen Jump and decided to check out a new manga called Dragon Ball. It's a very obscure title, but as One Piece fans, we have a lot to be thankful for with Dragon Ball, as Eiichiro Oda takes every opportunity that he can to sprinkle in a reference. Whether it be Luffy cosplaying as Master Roshi whilst infiltrating Dressrosa, King Neptune's Kamehameha, the dynamic of Luffy and Boa Hancock being extraordinarily similar to Goku and Chi-Chi, or some more obscure references like chapter 519, which features a colored cover page, something that almost never happens, and in this case it was colored as a tribute to the original run of Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z, which concluded after 519 chapters. Although I do think that one of my favorite inspirations comes from chapter 1000, when Luffy arrives on the rooftop of Onigashima and walks straight past both Big Mom and Kaido to go and check if Kinemon's okay, just as Goku walked straight past Vegeta and Nappa when he arrived back on Earth. And the One Piece anime has Dragon Ball references in, I think, almost every single episode. And that's because Toei, who also animated Dragon Ball, uses the same sound library from Dragon Ball with One Piece to this very day. Luffy's voice actor Mayumi Tanaka is also the voice of Krillin, and one of my personal favorite things ever were the eye catchers created with episode 1066, featuring Kozuki Oden and his family, recreating the famous Dragon Ball eye catchers, which a lot of people think was a tribute to Akira Toriyama, the author of Dragon Ball, after his passing. However, this was done about a year before Akira Toriyama left this world, so they did it for the pure love of the series, and to show just how much Dragon Ball contributed to the One Piece that we have today. After being profoundly inspired by his work as a chick, that's what my script says, that's an error, it should be child, Oda was formally introduced to Akira Toriyama fairly early on in his career by Masaya Tokuhiro, author of Jungle King Ta-chan, another highly influential force on One Piece, as Eiichiro Oda worked as Tokuhiro's assistant on this series. And first, point of order, despite being called Jungle King, the characters actually live in a savannah, but I digress. This experience is one of the most unknown but most important influences on what would eventually become One Piece. As part of his 18-month tenure as Tokuhiro's assistant, Oda was given a very painful panel to draw, because assistants generally exist to help the authors with menial tasks like drawing backgrounds and drawing crowds, massive crowds. And Oda was charged with drawing this crowd panel containing far too many of the people. And when Oda submitted his work to Tokuhiro, he asked Oda, "Are you satisfied with this?" And a very confused Eiichiro Oda, not quite sure why this question was being asked, simply replied with, yes I am. However, when this chapter was published in Weekly Shonen Jump, Oda opened the magazine and what he saw horrified him, because in an instant he understood. He understood that every character in this panel had been drawn with essentially the exact same face. Not only that, but they all had the same body type as well. There was no substantial variance in any of these characters, and Oda realized that this was a core problem with how he drew manga. And from this moment on, Oda implemented the belief and the practice that any manga character should be able to be identified by silhouette alone. Which is why in One Piece, Oda goes to such great lengths to make every character design unique, which results in a lot of wacky explorations. This might be the most important manga panel in One Piece history, and it's not even from One Piece. And almost 2 decades later, Tokuhiro would reflect on this and praise Oda by saying, "There are those who think of failure as a point of reflection and try to improve, and those who don't." And by this point, Oda had a mountain of failures under his belt. He had tried and failed to get about 20 different series off the ground at this point, all of which he reflected on and he improved upon. And much later on, Oda would honor his time with Tokuhiro by basing Shinobu on the character of Jane from Jungle King Ta-chan. But look, once One Piece had well and truly established itself, Oda was given the opportunity to conduct an interview with Akira Toriyama. An interview which took place in the very first One Piece color walk. Here you can see both of their avatars together, or not. There we go. Lovely. And this interview isn't like the other one we explored with Oda and Naruto author Masashi Kishimoto, where the tone was one of two best friends reminiscing about the past. In this case, Oda and Toriyama had much more of a child meeting his idol vibe to it, which gives us such a wonderful insight into what went into creating One Piece, and what still goes into creating it to this very day. Although it does admittedly start off a bit weird, as Oda is asked about the very first time that he read Dragon Ball, and he replies with, "How I first encountered Toriyama Sensei's manga was the second chapter of Dragon Ball. Regardless of when it was, I fell in love at first sight. I thought, he's too good. At that time, I loved Disney, but I was thinking that this is even better than Disney stuff." And Oda then asked Toriyama if he remembers a character named Ranfan from the 21st Tenkaichi Budokai, to which Toriyama replied, "Yes." But I should say this is a very fair question because Akira Toriyama was notorious for just forgetting that he'd created characters. And so Oda continued with, "It feels kind of weird to ask if you remember, but it seems as though you have forgotten a good amount of characters." Laugh. Anyway, you know how Ranfan took her clothes off, right? Her armpits during that scene were drawn really well. I thought you were the first person to accurately draw someone's armpit that well. Back then, I always drew people's armpits, those and Tao Pai Pai's hands. So this interview, like I said, it's off to a bit of a weird start. Furthermore, Chapter 2 of Dragon Ball is titled No Balls, and it isn't, it's not what people tend to think of when they think of the Dragon Ball franchise, as this chapter consisted entirely of Goku and Bulma taking a bath, and Goku discovering Bulma's terrible feminine secret, which is that she has no balls. Hence the title of the chapter. This is what Eiichiro Oda cites as having fallen in love with at first sight. Furthermore, the character he references, Ranfan, she was a competitor in the first World Martial Arts tournament that Goku entered, and her fighting style can be summarized as a combination of crying and stripping, with this right here being the armpit in question that Oda was referring to. Look, in Oda's defense, I don't think this is quite as creepy as it may sound. The idea is that Oda wasn't struck by the same appreciation of Dragon Ball as you or I may have. What really hit Oda was Toriyama's skill as an artist, with the other example being the hand of Mercenary Tao, which I believe is this panel, and Oda added that, when he posed, his hands were so well drawn. During that time, the only thing I drew were hands. Those things were what shocked me the most in Dragon Ball, armpits and hands, which I personally find a little bit funny because the two things that Oda is notoriously less good at drawing are hands and feet. He has a very kind of sausage finger sort of style that's hard to unsee once you've noticed it. But Toriyama then states that he had his own artistic challenges. I think that it's really difficult when you draw tanks or cars that exist in real life. That's because you can't screw anything up. When I'm feeling too lazy to think of designs, I end up using things from the real world, and that just proves to be a bigger hassle. And this is quite an underrated aspect of Dragon Ball, but Toriyama loved drawing vehicles. And that's one of the more key differences between Oda and Toriyama, because Oda agreed that drawing things that already exist in real life, which Toriyama did, for example, by drawing this Porsche, is extremely difficult, and that's why Oda prefers to keep One Piece more in the realm of fantasy and as far away from modern life as possible, so that Oda doesn't have to worry about those details. But in exchange, that unlocks his creativity, and Oda said that as a result, he is often drawing right up until the deadline because he keeps coming up with more and more stuff that he wants to add. But Oda also goes on to praise Toriyama's machines as one of his favorite aspects of Dragon Ball, in addition to armpits and hands. Oda identifies a point in Dragon Ball where the original villain Pilaf and his two associates all stand off against Goku in their own mini-mechs, and the first thing they do is burn off Goku's pants, which is wild. We've got full Will of D on display in this chapter, although that wasn't a rarity for the original Dragon Ball. But the second thing that the villains did was all merge together, and Oda cites this as one of his favorite and more formative moments. And Oda in the interview is vividly describing all of this, while Toriyama's just sitting across from him, smiling and nodding and going, "Yeah, I guess I drew that," because he doesn't remember. He genuinely doesn't remember anything he does. But Oda was really in awe of the creativity of having all of the mechs merge, and then essentially having Goku defeat this new creation in more or less a single shot, which in One Piece went on to become the inspiration for the legendary Pirate Docking 6 Big Emperor, an ability that would see Frankie, Zoro, Sanji, Usopp, and Chopper fuse together to create the ultimate pirate mech, which is swiftly shunned by Nico Robin, and it turns out to be useless, just like Pilaf's machines in Dragon Ball. Oda then accused Toriyama of thinking far enough ahead to know that one day these mechs would combine when he first introduced them, and hence why he designed them the way that they did. And I say accused because Toriyama denies this. There was notoriously pretty much never a plan when it came to Dragon Ball. But the topic of discussion then moved to idea generation, and this gives us a great sense of how Oda is able to constantly come up with so many new ideas. As he says, "When I was very little, I had decided that I would become a manga artist. So I thought up a thing things that I would draw when I become a manga artist list from my readership days. I still have a large supply of those ideas, and I still have lots of data as a reader in my head. So there is a part of me that thinks of drawing something that would make the readers happy. Unfortunately, how I perceive things now is different from how modern boys perceive things. But when I draw, I keep in mind, what would I be happy to see if I read it when I was young? So I can't really trust others when they tell me the info should go this way or that way. But if I think that I would have been happy to read this when I was a child, I can be proud of bringing my work into the world. So two things here. The first is that the secret to the sheer breadth of ideas explored in One Piece is that Oda has been generating and greedily hoarding these ideas ever since he was a young child. He knew he was going to become a manga author, and so he created the world's longest list of things that he would like to draw inspired by what he was reading and watching. And over the course of One Piece, he's slowly been crossing off those childhood desires on this list one by one. And the second thing I'd like to flag is what Toriyama said in response to this, which was, "That is so important. You turn yourself into a young reader again on purpose." And that right there is one of many secret ingredients to keeping One Piece as popular as it is today. Eiichiro Oda is a 50-year-old man now, but Oda is constantly able to place himself back into the mindset of a young boy, and he draws One Piece with his younger self in mind, which is why we always end up with a degree of wackiness that very few other authors can rival, and why we end up with a transformation like, say, Gear 5th. How Luffy uses Gear 5th is not something that the adult mind comes up with, because it spits in the face of wrinkly old man logic. Toriyama was then asked if he has any encouraging words for Oda, and Toriyama gave us some words. He said, "Oda-kun, there's nothing else for me to say. My own child also reads One Piece voraciously too. So I also read it, and I really understood why everyone was crazy about One Piece. So just keep doing your best from now on." So Oda and Toriyama, they got along quite well. But it's at this point that I'd like to introduce a new, more sinister character to the story. His name is Kazuhiko Torishima, one of Toriyama's manga editors, and a man who was born to be an antagonist. So much so that during the production of Dr. Slump, Torishima berated Toriyama, stating that his main villain wasn't intimidating enough, and so he ordered Toriyama to think of the person that he hated most for his inspiration, which turned out to be Torishima himself. And so Akira Toriyama literally turned his editor into the main villain of the Dr. Slump manga. And furthermore, King Piccolo from Dragon Ball was also allegedly based on Torishima. But Torishima is one of the main reasons why One Piece was almost never published. According to all reports, very few people at Shueisha believed that Oda's story was worth investing in, and what made it particularly harsh was that the legendary editor of Dragon Ball, Kazuhiko Torishima, was especially doubtful and cynical, having stated, "Manga that doesn't sell well is just trash for the editors to deal with." And very eventually, Torishima was outvoted on this, but he stuck to his guns and he told Oda to his face, "If One Piece becomes popular, then I'll admit defeat," which is something that he did eventually do. But I imagine that in Oda's position, it must have been quite difficult to have the editor of the story that you admire most in this world just continuously shitting all over you, which continues to this very day, actually. Torishima remained something of an antagonist of Oda, and when he did a TV interview in 2023, he did praise Oda for his passion and creativity, but he did criticize One Piece as a whole because he believes that due to its incredible popularity, the modern day series editors can no longer do their job because they cannot disagree with the decisions that Oda wants to make. His argument is that Oda is now far too intimidating of a presence to be disagreed with. It's sort of like being hired to become Shakespeare's writing assistant and to give him advice on his plays. And in this case, I do definitely get where Torishima's coming from, because how can any new editor not be intimidated by Oda? What are you supposed to do? Tell the author of the best-selling manga of all time that his idea is wrong? Well, in theory, yes, that's what your job description is, to notice these problems early on and to fix them. But Torishima has also accused Eiichiro Oda of becoming far too involved in the One Piece anime. If I were Oda's editor, I would give him extremely strict feedback on his manga because he has talent, but Oda has become far too involved in anime. My dissatisfaction is not so much with One Piece itself, but rather with the editorial policies of Shonen Jump. Torishima implied that the quality of the One Piece manga may have gone down as a result. And this is also an interesting comment because I would love to know what degree Oda is involved with the anime, because my understanding is that he really doesn't touch too much of the anime. If he did, it's kind of crazy the decisions that they make. And also, in defense of Torishima, I should say that his approach worked very well with Akira Toriyama, who was an author that really needed a strong push and a solid sense of direction. Dragon Ball definitely wouldn't be what it is without Torishima, and therefore also One Piece wouldn't be what it is without Torishima. And I do also appreciate that he seems to be the only person in this industry who's willing to blatantly blatantly speak his mind. It's quite refreshing, even if I don't necessarily agree with everything he's saying. But being on Torishima's bad side, if anything, just proved that Oda had put himself on Toriyama's path. And Oda would eventually get to collaborate with his idol on a crossover chapter of One Piece and Dragon Ball called Cross Epoch, which is a charming little team-up story that ends with a big old party featuring the main characters of each respective series that, in retrospect, looks a lot like what would go on to become Big Mom's tea party during Whole Cake Island. However, there is quite a somber end to the story, as in 2024, Akira Toriyama did pass away and Oda released the following statement. "It is too early, the hole is too big. Sadness washes over me when I think that I will never see him again. I have admired him so much since I was a child, so I remember the day he called me by name for the first time. On the way home from the day you used the word friend for me and Kishimoto, I remember being overjoyed with Kishimoto. I also remember the last conversation we had. I was one of those who took the baton from the days when reading manga made you a fool, and he also created the era where both adults and children could enjoy reading manga. He showed us the dream that manga can go worldwide. It was like watching a hero going forward. For not only mangaka, but creators in various industries, the excitement and emotion of the time of Dragon Ball serialization must have taken root in their childhood. His existence is like a big tree. For the manga artists of our generation who stood on the same stage, Toriyama's works became more and more important to me as I got closer to the same stage. I even felt it was quite scary, but I am just happy to see the aloof man himself again, because we love him on a blood level. With respect and gratitude for the creative world he has left behind, I pray for his soulful rest in peace. May heaven be the joyous world that he envisioned. And may we always remember that the One Piece that we have today would be nothing without the Dragon Ball of yesterday."